And like I say, before every show, I bless the mic because I got something to say. I rock headphones because I'm listening twice as much as I talk. At least I like to believe that that's what I do. I like to believe that's what I do, but I know that we chopping it up on the blue one. We're going to talk about real quick tonight something that is really bothering me as as a man who does things in the community. First, I want to bring on my guest. He's not a stranger to the show. He's gonna be on the show probably a lot of the times that we have the show. I got on the show Garrett Daniels. What's up? What's up, Garrett? What's up? How you doing?
Hey, what's up? I'm doing good. Doing good. Once again, glad to be here. Thank you for having me, and looking forward to the conversation. As I always say, it's much needed, and definitely if we center it around the youth and around parenting and kids, it's a conversation we need to have for sure.
Yes, and we're gonna have it. First of all, Garrett is a great father. Garrett is also
Thank you.
married. I think I'm a great father. I think, and I'm also married, and I do
Absolutely.
think that qualifies us to have the conversation. Not if, and I am divorced. Okay, I have another wife. She's my second wife, but I'm talking about this because of some things that's just been happening in the news. Okay, now this show is about the wounds we have as men and how it affects our parenting. But first, we have talked about in some other shows about how when fathers are not in the home, how kids end up, correct? So, like if you don't have a father in the home, a lot of social ills are connected to children. So, like kids are more likely to go to jail, they're more likely to have mental illness. They're more likely to get bad grades. They're more likely to use a gun. They're more likely, the girls are more likely to be pregnant as teenagers. And it's just an issue we have in the home. And that's when the father is not there. Correct. And a
Right.
lot of times we see things like the flash mob that was in Chicago. They down there beating up tourists on straight foolishness, of course. And then we also, it was just one in Tinley Park, actually, the day before yesterday. It was another flash mob in Tinley Park. Okay. We even had in Homewood 40 teenagers acting rowdy today, and the police had to come up there because my son was up there. So it's a lot of stuff that's going on right now. And you had John Morant. And John Morant, oddly, had two parents in the household. So what we want to talk about is fatherlessness is attached to kids being prone to a lot of social ills. Well, what if a man has wounds? How does it affect a kid if a man has wounds and he's not able to raise his kids in the appropriate manner because of his own wounds? Okay. So, first, what is a wound? I said in another show, basically, a wound in the natural is something that breaks the skin or something that may break the bones. It's something that may cause an injury because of an impact, a blow, or a cut. So there are natural things that can happen to the physical body that make us bleed, that may break a bone, that may break the skin. We may get a sprained ankle, right? We may get a torn muscle, whatever that impact or blow is. But in life, circumstances can happen to men that cause us to be impacted, that cause us to develop wounds that may cause us to be malfunctional or dysfunctional. And I said that in another podcast, meaning we function, but a wound, if it's not healed, if it's not tended to, if it's covered up, can cause us to be malfunctional or dysfunctional. So my question is, how can a wound hinder how we parent? Because a lot of times we apply these wounds to marriages, correct? Where I don't handle my woman the right way, I'm tripping, whatever. How can a wound, since it's an impact or blow, how can it cause a malfunction or dysfunction that distorts our parenting? If you want to start us off on that topic, does a wound interfere with parenting?
Well, I definitely, think that anytime you have a situation growing up that has an impact on your psyche, as a child, certain things are imprinted, in our minds, in our spirits. And, if it can be conceived negative, then we tend to carry that with us. And then eventually when it's our turn to become parents, we parent from that perspective, right? So if you were not, if someone were abused or someone were, mistreated when they were a kid, they may operate in the sense of, well, this is normal. This is how parenting should be. So they pass that on to their kids. And it's kind of like you have this generational cycle that keeps going where it's like, man, no father in the household maybe in some instances, or if you have a father present, maybe he has some damage, some damages, some things that happen to him, whether it be, social, in the street, something, outside of the house, maybe something inside the house. And so those kinds of things impact how you decide to parent, and I feel like it's such a vital conversation that we're having because as you mentioned earlier, the youth are a direct reflection of society and of the things that is going on right now and how they're acting. And so, it's just something that basically we need to get our hands on and get a handle on quickly if we want to try to find some remedy to these big problems that we're having with our youth right now. But yeah, not to ramble too much, but yeah, as a man with the wounds that we have, definitely is something that impacts the youth, one way or another.
Yes, and you said something about, I think what's tricky about a wound, and you said something about wounds being passed on. I think what's tricky about a wound is a lot of men, we don't know we have them. So you're
Right.
passing on something to your son or your daughter that you're not even aware that you have. Because a lot of times, especially as a black man, and I know you know this, Garrett, in the black community, we talk about generational wealth all the time. But what about
Hmm.
generational wounds? What about generational wounds? What about things we pass down to our children that we are not aware of? So, for instance, if you are a man and you were fearful as a child because you got physically abused, you know, so you have this heightened sense of arousal and you're very fearful, and now you don't realize that when you have kids, when your kid wants to take a risk and try something new, you're telling them no. You're telling them no because the same fear that you experienced as a kid, you're passing that fear down to your child. So you don't let them take risks. You don't let them go on camping
Hmm.
trips. You don't let them try new activities. And you don't realize that your reason for not letting them try things is because you were so physically abused, or you had such a heightened arousal that bad things will happen to you, that you don't realize that that anxiety is heightened when it's time for your child to experience new things. So now your child becomes a product of your womb because you're not even aware that you have it. And this happens in a lot of instances with a lot of kids because I see parents, they're not conscious of what their wounds are. And if you're not conscious of it, you're going to hand that wound off just like a baton to your kid because you're not even aware that you have it. And what happens with children, since they learn from modeling, they're going to grab that baton and they're going to run, and they're going to run, and you're not going to even notice that dysfunction because you're used to it. And I think this is
Hmm.
what happens to us when we parent, that if we never get healed from injury. So let's say if I was teaching my kid how to walk, and I was limping really bad, right? This is going to be a bad example, but it's going to make a point. If I teach my kid how to walk when I'm limping, they might start getting the impression that they're supposed to walk with a limp. So I'm looking at my
Yeah.
kids whose ankles are not hurt, but when they walk with the same limp I walk with, even though nothing is wrong with them. How could you build on that? What do you think about that when we're passing stuff on to our children that we did not even know we had an issue with?
Well, I think, a lot of times, again, going back to the whole idea of what's considered normal, you know, and what's considered abnormal as far as, the different things we're like exposed to growing up. And so, some people grow up faster than other people because they're exposed to more things at a younger age. And so, and maybe that causes them to mature faster, or however you want to describe it. But then when they get older, they may say, okay, well, I need to overly shelter my kids from, certain experiences. And then by doing that, it almost becomes counterproductive, because when they do get a level of freedom, then they get wild and crazy. You know what I'm saying? They get buck wild and get crazy. So you, even in your best effort to try to shield or protect, because you may have recognized, a certain thing that you dealt with, a certain struggle that you had growing up, even by trying to protect your children from that, there's still some collateral damage that they can experience by you even being that, closed off, tight knit, overprotective parent. And then of course you got the flip side where maybe your kids are exposed to everything growing up similar to how you were. And, they
Yeah.
grow up fast. And I think that's another thing in this day and time where kids are just growing up faster, in my opinion. Like, they have so much information at their fingertips to where they see
Hmm.
stuff, they experience stuff, could be exposed to stuff by parents. And so it makes their journey, I think, a little bit more challenging because of that.
Yes, and I want to build upon something you said. You said kids grow up too fast. And sometimes they can grow up too fast. And one thing I've noticed, Garrett, is that if you're a man and you have a wound of rejection, like you want to be accepted, I see this with, especially with, no, I see it with males and females. But when you're a man who suffers from rejection and you want to be
Mm,
accepted, sometimes we want to be accepted by our children. So it makes it
wow.
harder for us to establish boundaries when we establish boundaries. Because we want our kids to think we're cool. We want our kids to
Yeah.
think we understand things. And I take pride in the fact that me and my kids are not from the same generation. I didn't have my first child till I was 35. So
Hmm.
we're not really close in age like that. And I think sometimes it's real subtle wounds, like you suffer from rejection. You were never in the in crowd. You were ridiculed. You were persecuted. You didn't have a good relationship with people in your house. So you endeavor to have that relationship so tight with your kids that you allow them to do things that you have no business allowing them to do. Meaning that your boundaries are not what they should be because you want to be closer to you want to be accepted by your kids, not close to your
That's
kids. You
real.
want to be accepted by your kids. And another thing, if you had kids early, right? And I'm not saying this is everybody, but a lot of times, if we had kids too early, there's not enough years between you and that child for you guys to be from different generations. Okay. And
Hmm.
now you're growing up with your kid like they're your friend and you're not a parent. And you're starting your parenting journey as a child. Right? So
Mm.
since you're starting your parenting journey as a child, it makes it more difficult for you to establish adult boundaries. And I'm finding that a lot of times these wounds, this fatherlessness, if we suffer from that rejection, that's a wound that can show up in parenting in a lot of different ways. That's just one. What do you think about certain wounds that may show up in men that will affect how they parent their children?
Well, I think, one thing that we as men, we struggle with is a sense of pride, and like we can be too prideful in certain situations. So, having the need to always be right and not be humble enough to say, I'm wrong or I messed
Yeah,
up. And sometimes we can pass those traits on to our kids where it's like, it almost becomes like a sense of entitlement. Like, you
yeah.
can do no wrong. Everybody gets a trophy. Everybody's a winner. There's no losers in life. Can't nobody
Mhm.
tell you when you do something wrong. And so if you grew up, or as a man, if you receive that kind of wound of not being able to have anybody tell you when you're wrong, your peers,
Yeah.
can't nobody at your job tell you you're wrong, and you end up raising your kids. It may not even be something that you're proactively doing with your kids. The kids are smart. And somebody said one time, kids are like sand because you can make such a great impact or imprint on them. So they could just be watching your behavior and how you handle things and
Yeah.
pick up on those certain traits. So I think that's just one example of how a wound for specifically for a man and our ego and pride can get transferred into how we parent our kids and the things they pick up from that.
I have a good one, Gary.
All
I
right.
have a good one, and you're gonna like talking about it too. I got a good
All
one.
right.
I posted on social media today that I read a news article yesterday that they polled black teenagers. I think it was in Columbus, Ohio. And these black teenagers said that they experienced 5 experiences of discrimination every single day. I'm going to say that again.
Wow.
They experienced 5 instances of discrimination every day. Here's my theory behind it, because I think that since we are black men, it is okay to say that black men have been wounded by racism in one way or another. Whether they've been discriminated against, whether it's vicariously, whether somebody shared the experience with them, where somebody shared the trauma with them, because we know trauma can be passed down. Here is my theory, that we as black men have been so wounded by racism, we've been so wounded by oppression, that a lot of times we pass this wound down in a way that we make it difficult for our children to carry. Meaning that it's not
Mm.
that oppression is not real. It's not that racism may not be real. It's not that discrimination may not be real, but I do believe that the way it's communicated. So if I communicate racism to my child in a way where I'm not speaking from my womb, but I'm speaking from a place of healing, I think what I deposit in my child is a healthy way to handle racism. It's a healthy way to handle oppression. It's a healthy way to supersede the quote unquote glass ceiling and the chains on the mind and the hands or the feet of the black man. I think sometimes when we speak of racism, we speak from racism and discrimination from a wounded place. And what we do is we pass injury down to our children instead of
Mm.
passing healing and hope to our children. Instead of us passing down hope and a bright future, we pass down darkness and anger to our kids. So I want to know what's your take, because I want you to think about it. I did the math. If it's 5 discrimination instances every day, right? If it's 30 days, that's like 150
Yeah.
in a month. No, long no,
Yeah.
it's 35 in a week. At the end of the year, it's 1,825 times that this kid has been discriminated against. What what can we do as black men, that when we pass down, when we talk to our kids about racism, discrimination, and oppression, that we don't speak from a wounded place, but a place of healing, providing we have been healed? It's just something I'm throwing on the table right now,
Yeah.
because that's a shocking statistic, that a teenager feels like they've been discriminated against 5 times. I think some of that may be true, but some of that is we program them so much about the wound of racism that they see it in everything. And I'm not saying I'm totally correct. What's your take on
Right.
that?
Man, I literally, as you were speaking, the word victim and victim, the words victim and victimization, popped into my head. And I think just, I want to make sure I'm saying this correctly. Like, I want to make sure that we don't pass on a victim or a victimization
Yeah.
mind frame, right? Because yes, negative things may happen to us, bad things may happen to people, bad things happen all the time to good people. People experience, discrimination, racism, however you want to say it. But I think when we approach it not in a victim's mind frame, but in a, you know what, this is a situation that happened, and I'm not trying to minimize anybody's experience, but this is a
Yeah.
situation that happened, but I am not a victim, and this does not define me. And it doesn't, whatever happened to my ancestors, I'm acknowledging that because it's real and it's a fact and it's historical fact, while at the same time not letting it define me as a victim. As a matter of fact, I'm strong and stronger, and I've overcome because of those things that happened. Because of the many sacrifices that people made, sometimes willingly or unwillingly, to allow me to have the things and be in the place where I am now, to stand up and be like, you know what? I'm not going to let society, I'm not going to let the narrative, I'm not going to let mainstream media, whatever you want to call it, portray me as a victim, because as soon as we allow that to happen, we lose our power.
Mm.
You know what I'm saying? We no
Yeah.
longer have
Yeah.
the power to reclaim our own narrative. It's now being created by somebody else. And there, when somebody else creates your narrative, they're gonna be whatever you want them to be every single time. So I would just say, start with looking at yourself in the mirror and just saying, I'm not a victim. I am not
Mm.
a victim, and I will not be a victim, no matter the circumstances. I know, again, people go through rough, very rough, traumatic, tragic things in life. And we hear stories all the time of people coming out on the other end stronger, better, greater, more victorious, more successful. In spite of those things, they learn how to not turn themselves into a victim and succumb to that mind state. So that's one thing that I would say that we could maybe focus on and look at changing the narrative on.
Yes, and I like how you said it too. That because I think when we think about men having wounds, especially as black men, this is a wound that seems to be pretty pervasive. Like we live in a backdrop where everything is made racial. Like if something
Yeah.
happens, and we have to watch how we talk to our children about any type of wound, but especially a wound of racism.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times we don't understand that we're passing down anger and venom to our children. I don't think we realize
Yeah.
that. And when you said victim, I don't think that we realize that if we make racism if we make racism bigger than our child, they will become a victim of it. They will become a victim of
Absolutely.
racism because they can't see the end of the road. Meaning, I'm willing to believe that if a black kid feels like they're discriminated against 35 times in a week, some of that is their perception. Some of that is them reading into stuff. Some of that is vicarious wounds. You know what I'm saying? And I
Hmm.
so believe that when you said the victim, we are not victims. And when we talk about wounds, that can be applied to any kind of wound, not just racism. If you were physically abused, you are not a victim. If you were sexually abused, you don't have to be a victim. If you grew up in poverty, you don't have to be a victim. If you were disfigured or whatever, you don't have to be a victim, meaning that we have to be conscious of these wounds because we will pass down the emotion. In psychology, it's called vicarious trauma. And
Mm.
vicarious trauma is something you didn't actually experience on your own, but because you hear about it so much, and because a lot of counselors go through vicarious trauma because we hear people's terrible traumas every day. So it's no different with racism, it's no different with sexual abuse, it's no different with physical abuse, it's no different with wars, it's no different with violence, it's no different with crime. If you hear about this stuff too much, you can become a victim of vicarious trauma. That's why we have to be really cautious about how we share our wounds consciously with our children. So like we said at the beginning, if I'm not aware of my rejection, I'm not setting boundaries the right way. But if I'm aware that I'm wounded by racism, I have to make sure I'm healed enough to explain that in such a way that I don't wound my kid when I explain it to him, that I don't create too much anger, I don't create too much hurt, and I don't create too much hopelessness. And this also happens with a kid when they have a wound with their father or their mother, right? So
Yep.
if I as a parent have a wound with my father, so I had a father wound where me and my father was not always there. He was in and out. So now when it's time for me to be my time for me to have kids, I have to make sure I don't overcompensate for what my father did. And I have to also make sure that I don't do what he did because that's all I saw. Okay? So I have the responsibility to learn about my wound, not nurse my wound, but get healing for my wound
Mm.
so that it doesn't affect what I do with my own children. What can you speak about a wound and how you kind of got to get some understanding and some healing from it and at least be conscious of it so that you parent your kid and not your wound.
Well, I'll tell you, and probably I kind of alluded to this on a couple of past podcasts with you, but I have a mother and a father wound because, again, raised by my grandparents, and I didn't really have a relationship with either of my biological parents growing up. Not as strong as maybe traditionally you would want to have. And so, when I started having kids, me and my wife started our family, and we had kids. Immediately, I was like very, very protective of that relationship between me and my parents, because over time, I had kind of reconnected, but being very protective about their interaction with my kids, and like the stability that we present every day for them versus my parents being in and out of the scene, or being here and then something happens and maybe they're not there. So I didn't want my kids to feel that feeling of abandonment that we had talked about before as well. And so I have to be, I won't say had, because it's still current. I have to be very careful not to overcompensate for the things that I may have felt growing up as a kid, or the things that I may have experienced, because my kids don't have that life. Their life is totally different than mine. You know what I'm saying? They have both of their parents in their lives. Um, they have, and I had stability with my grandparents, but it was just a different kind of stability. There's a generational divide with grandparents raising kids. And you kind of alluded to the whole generational thing early with age, and like kind of being closer in age if you have kids at a younger age, and things of that nature. But like, what I would consider, our household to be more traditional now, where my wife and I are here together raising the kids. But those wounds from me growing up, they will come up at the weirdest times. Like, may not even be thinking about it or dealing with anything related to either of my parents, but then it'll come up, and then I have to like check myself. And thankfully, I have a wife that has no problem telling me, when I need to, correct my thinking in certain areas. So, but it's real, and it's really something you have to deal with. And it's not to say it won't become a recurring thing. Sometimes you think, oh, I'm over this, or it was years ago, but again, it'll come up, and you just have to keep dealing with it and keep reminding yourself, like, no, this is a very different situation. So I don't have to react or act a certain way. And so you try to empower yourself through, through going through that process, and then empower your children to be able to understand the difference between, okay, that was my dad's life, this is my life, and I can see and understand, the difference between the two.
Yes, and one thing I want to emphasize right now to men is this, that if you don't get help for your wound will parent your children.
Mm,
Say that again. If you
wow.
don't help for your wound will parent your children, because whatever you are not aware of will control you. You have to be aware of the effects of your childhood trauma or your childhood wound on your manhood thoughts and behaviors. Because what you do not resolve as a child, you will play out as an adult. Okay, so if you suffer from rejection, it's going to show up in your adult life if it's not addressed. If you struggle from fear because you were physically abused, it's going to show up in your adult life. If you were under love, it's going to show up in your adult life. If you weren't held accountable as a kid, it's going to show up in your adult life. And man, I'm telling you, if we do not address our wounds, they will parent our children. So even if, watch this, even if a father is in the home, the kid can still be fatherless.
Mm.
Just because you're in the home doesn't mean you're in the home. And we have to be more conscious of how these wounds are manifesting in our relationships, especially with our children. And you got to pay attention to if your kid doesn't want to talk to you, if your kid doesn't want to spend time with you, or if your kid always has issues with you. I'm not saying your kid is not a trip, but I am saying you may need to evaluate some of the things that you're doing, because the thing about wounds, a wound sometime, I compared it to something else before. Have you ever had an itch, Garrett, on a place in your back, and when you reach for it, your hand couldn't reach it?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And you
Yes.
trying to find a wall, you rubbing your back up against
Right.
the wall because you just can't
Yeah.
reach that spot. That's how it is
Yeah.
with a wound sometimes. Sometimes that wound is agitated. Sometimes that wound is itching and you can't put any healing on it and you can't scratch it. You can't alleviate the discomfort because you can't get to it. You just can't put your finger on what it is. And when you're confused as a man with a wound, it will manifest in how you raise your children. So, Garrett, if you
Yep.
had to tell these people some solutions to, a wound that they may have, or what's a solution to how you can raise your kids and your wound not raise them for you?
Well, I always like to start off with acknowledgement. A lot of times we're taught to avoid or to overlook or to just, pretend like it doesn't even exist, even though, it's like the emperor has no clothes. Like everybody can see, but nobody's saying anything. So you have to acknowledge
Mm,
that this does exist. Yes, it is a thing. I have this problem. I have this issue. I'm not ashamed of acknowledging that I have this issue. You got to be real and honest with yourself. Because if you can't be real and honest with yourself, you can't even begin to have honest conversation with anybody else. So I
yeah,
think that's number one, acknowledgement. And then after you acknowledge it, you have to kind of, you got to take steps to, um, seek out ways to resolve it. Support, find people. It's so amazing how oftentimes, you'll be going through something and you find somebody else that either has gone through what you're dealing with or maybe going through it while you're dealing with it. So, and I'm sure there are groups that you can kind of deal with or, organizations or your peers, but I always like to try to start at the basic, easiest places, talking to your peer group, your surroundings, your family, just having a real honest dialogue. So acknowledge, dialogue, and then, try to make changes. Even if it's a little change, like, man, every time I get upset, I do XYZ. Well, maybe you stop doing one of those three things,
yeah,
and take a step towards finding alternative ways to channel that emotion. Not that you want to be emotionless or emotionally unavailable, but you want to find a different way to channel it and finding ways to resolve it and modeling the behavior that you want your children to exude. That's one thing I say, man, my father-in-law, great man. And one of the things I've learned from him over the years, he was like, you got to model the behavior you want your kids to
right.
have. So
That's right.
whatever you doing, and it starts at as soon as they come out the womb and they can look up at you and see you,
Yeah.
they are modeling everything you're doing, whether it's good, bad, and different. So, you want to try your best to model and be what you want your kids to be and tell them and be honest, dad is not perfect. I have many faults that I'm
Right.
working on. And I think they will look up to you even more and really like respect you even more as they get older because you're being honest about your shortcomings. And yeah, they're gonna look at you like you Superman, but at the same time, Superman had kryptonite.
Say
So
that.
acknowledging they gonna look
Yeah.
at you like that, but you got your weaknesses, you got your shortcomings, and being honest about it will help them understand, oh, you know what, I'm probably gonna have some in my life too, but it's okay because I'm still gonna be able to make it and be successful and thrive and be a contributing member of society and all those good things because my dad, even though he said he's dealing with this, man, he's still out here. He's working. He loves us. He's providing. He's doing all these different things. So those are just a few things that I think would be helpful in that journey.
Oh man, it was so much wisdom loaded in what you said, and I'm not yanking your chain. It really was. And so I came up with 4 A's while you were talking, and I'm gonna add yours in there. Okay. So I'm gonna start with one solution is right. First, you got to become aware of your wound. And when you become aware of it, what I mean by awareness is when something happens in your life and it pricks you and it kind of hurts, or you have strong emotion, or you have no emotion at all, you know you have a wound. That's it. Strong emotion or no emotion is something wrong with you, bro. You might not want to admit it. So when you become aware of it, that's number one. You got to become aware of it. Number two is Garrett's acknowledgement. On the second A, that acknowledgement, you have to acknowledge this wound. Just because you're aware of it, it doesn't mean any darn thing because you're aware of it. Like Garrett said, you have to acknowledge it. Tell your kids, look, I have this flaw. These are my strengths. These are my weaknesses. I'm not a perfect man. And when you acknowledge stuff, you can apologize to your children for things sometimes because as men, we miss the
Absolutely.
mark. So you got to first be aware. And then, like Garrett said, you got to acknowledge, right? That third one, after you acknowledge it, bro, you got to address it. All right. You're
Mm,
aware of it, you acknowledge of it, but then you gotta address it. You gotta do something about it. It's like if you went and got a deep, deep gash in your arm, man, you gotta throw some peroxide and some alcohol in there. I prefer using
yeah.
the alcohol because the alcohol gonna let you know something wrong with you. You'll look
Yeah,
at
for
that
sure.
peroxide, in life, if it's just peroxide, it'll bubble a little bit and you can put that wound off. You throw that alcohol in there, bro, you're gonna be like, oh my God, I have a gas because it's gonna burn the mess out of you. You need
Right.
to address that wound with alcohol because when it stings, you may go do something about it, right? And then the fourth A, apply, right? Apply the wisdom. Apply some wisdom to the wound. Like go get help from someone. Call a friend, get a therapist. And I don't like to talk in the words if the universe is speaking to you. But if your wife sees your wound, your kids see your
Yeah.
wound, your employer sees your wound, your best friend sees your wound, the kids in the track club see your wound, the fans see your wound.
Hmm.
All these people see your wound. Apply the wisdom they are giving you about this wound. Apply that wisdom to your life. Apply it to your life so you become aware of it, you acknowledge it, you address it, then you apply wisdom to it. Once you apply wisdom to it, now you're able to actively live with it. Like you become active in your life with the wound. And the reason why I'm including that A is because sometimes when we get a wound, we're not active anymore. We get a wound, and I'm going back to what Garrett said, just because you have a wound, just because you have a weakness, does not mean you cease to be active in your kid's life. I don't care. And you know what? I hope you're not doing this. If your kid, look, let me give y'all a testimony. He's going to make this plain. I walked into the living room and saw my father smoking crack, cocaine in the room. I heard it sizzling and everything. Like I saw it with my own eyes. He still told me not to use drugs. you, he
Hmm.
still was active enough to say, son, you better not do this. Now, can you say he was hypocritical? I don't know. He had an addiction. But I want you guys to understand that having a wound does not give you an excuse not to be active. Because when you become inactive, you do nothing. And as parents, we can never afford to do nothing, y'all. We gotta be active. So you gotta be aware of it. And then we use Gary's A. You gotta acknowledge it. You gotta acknowledge it and tell your children, yo, it's something wrong here. I'm working on this. And after that, you address it. I prefer alcohol because when stuff stings, you're more willing to do something about it, right? And then
Hmm.
apply wisdom to it. Everybody telling you you a fool, man. Believe them. You a fool, dude. And then the last one, be active. Don't use a wound as an excuse to do this parenting stuff. We could talk about this all night. This parenting stuff, and the reason why I like that Garrett is actually on here is because he's not a perfect father, but I know he's good. I know his children, and I know his wife, and you can tell when a man's kids love him and when his wife does. Doesn't mean he's perfect. It doesn't mean any of us are perfect, but you know what I'm saying, Gary. You know what I'm saying. As
Absolutely.
black men, we have to pay attention to our wounds because if we don't pay attention to our wounds, if we don't, let me say it this way, if we don't parent our wounds will
Mm.
parent our children. So you know what?
Wow.
I bless this mic because I got something to say. I rock headphones because I'm listening twice as much as I talk. You have participated in the Blue Room I'm not gonna call him a guest. It's Garrett. The man has some wisdom inside of that head of his, and I like chopping it up with him. If you want to get more content like this, subscribe to Move Your Life. Again, move your life. And next time, I will see you all in the blue room.